What if I told you that the most terrifying vampire in history wasn't a creature of legend, but a noblewoman with real power? A queen so obsessed with youth that she turned her castle into a factory of death. Stay with me because this true story is darker than any horror movie. Imagine living in a world where power meant life or death. The year is the late 1500s. Castles rise against the dark forests of Hungary, and superstition rules the lives of peasants. Plus, what if I told you that the most terrifying vampire in history wasn't a creature of legend, but a noblewoman with real power? A queen so obsessed with youth that she turned her castle into a factory of death. Stay with me because this true story is darker than any horror movie. Imagine living in a world where power meant life or death. The year is the late 1500s. Castles rise against the dark forests of Hungary, and superstition rules the lives of peasants. For decades, she moved freely among kings and nobles, untouchable by law, shielded by her wealth and title. Yet inside her castle, a nightmare unfolded, a nightmare that claimed the lives of countless young girls. How could she hide such horror for so long? Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful families, the Báthorys. Their name commanded respect and fear across Europe. But behind the polished image of nobility was a legacy soaked in violence. Public executions were considered entertainment, and cruelty was a sign of strength. Elizabeth grew up watching people burned, tortured, and impaled, not as punishments, but as performances for the elite. From a young age, Elizabeth showed an unsettling fascination with suffering. While other children played with toys, she studied the agonized faces of dying prisoners, almost as if she were taking notes. The seeds of her future cruelty were already being planted. By the time they married in 1575, Ferenc was already feared for his savage treatment of enemies. He had impaled captives, left soldiers to die slowly, and earned a reputation for battlefield cruelty that made even hardened warriors shudder. For Elizabeth, this marriage was not a romance. It was a partnership in darkness. While Ferenc spent long stretches fighting the Ottoman Empire, he visited home with tales of blood and pain. The Báthorys weren't just wealthy, they were untouchable. Several family members had reputations as sadistic rulers, infamous for their schemes and violence. For Elizabeth, this was the world she inherited, one where power excused brutality, and where a noble's desires outweighed a peasant's life. And Elizabeth would take that inheritance further than anyone before her. At age 11, Elizabeth was engaged to Ferenc Endazdi, a Hungarian military commander known as the Black Knight. By the time they married in 1575, Ferenc was already feared for his savage treatment of enemies. He had impaled captives, left soldiers to die slowly, and earned a reputation for battlefield cruelty that made even hardened warriors shudder. For Elizabeth, this marriage was not a romance. It was a partnership in darkness. While Ferenc spent long stretches fighting the Ottoman Empire, he visited home with tales of blood and pain. Some historians suggest that he taught Elizabeth torture methods, passing down his cruelty as if it were a family recipe. Yet Elizabeth did not remain a student for long. She innovated her own punishments, often directing them at her servants. Something as small as breaking a dish or arriving late could result in hours of torment. Most newlyweds exchange recipes or heirlooms. Elizabeth and Ferenc exchanged techniques of suffering. But when Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth would no longer need a teacher or a partner. She was free to unleash her darkest impulses alone. The death of Ferenc left Elizabeth in full control of her lands, her wealth, and most importantly, her castle. With no one to restrain her, the cruelty that once trickled out in punishments now poured into something far more terrifying. She turned her fortress into a carefully designed house of horrors. Servants were dispatched to villages, promising young peasant girls jobs in the castle. They painted a picture of safety, warmth, and regular meals, luxuries poor families could only dream of. Parents, desperate for their daughters' futures, sent them willingly. They had no idea they were signing death warrants. Once the girls entered the castle walls, escape was nearly impossible. Surrounded by forests, guarded by loyal men, and cut off from outside help, the victims were trapped. Elizabeth experimented with new methods of pain, blending cruelty with creativity. She froze girls naked in the snow, only to scald them moments later with boiling water. She devised instruments that prolonged agony, keeping victims alive for hours. Every act was precise, calculated, and executed with chilling efficiency. Elizabeth's castle had become her laboratory. But soon, her obsession would move beyond torture into something far darker, a twisted pursuit of eternal youth. One day, Elizabeth struck a servant girl. Blood splattered onto her hand, and she imagined the skin looked softer. Whether illusion or delusion, it didn't matter. That single moment planted an obsession that would shape the rest of her life. Elizabeth convinced herself that young blood held the secret to stopping time. Soon, servants were collecting blood in bowls, tubs, and basins. Special baths were prepared where Elizabeth would soak in the warm fluid, believing it renewed her youth. But bathing wasn't enough. She began drinking blood, mixing it with wine, convinced it worked better from within. Some accounts even claim she had blood puddings prepared, turning horror into cuisine. Her inner circle of servants became accomplices. They recruited victims, drained their blood, disposed of bodies, and shared in the cruelty, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of enjoyment. Elizabeth recorded details meticulously: ages, villages, and even methods she found effective. Historians estimate she killed more than 600 girls, though the exact number remains hidden by the efficiency of her disposal system. Elizabeth wasn't just killing, she believed she was building her own fountain of youth. But how could someone commit such horrors for decades without anyone stopping her? The answer lay not in her castle walls, but in the systems that protected her. Elizabeth's brutality was no secret. Whispers spread through villages, and rumors reached courts. Speaking against a noblewoman like Elizabeth wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. Even those who dared to investigate often vanished mysteriously. Her own family connections formed the final barrier. Cardinals, governors, and military leaders shared her bloodline, ensuring no one wanted the scandal exposed. For over 20 years, Elizabeth perfected her shield of corruption, fear, and privilege. But eventually, she made one mistake that power couldn't protect. Elizabeth grew bold. Poor peasant girls were easy prey, but they were enough. She began targeting daughters of minor nobles. Unlike peasants, these families had power, connections, and influence. And when noble bloodlines were threatened, silence turned into outrage. Reports of missing young women reached King Matthias of Hungary. He ordered an investigation, assigning the task to Elizabeth's own cousin, Guy Thurs. At first, the expectation was simple: cover it up, as had been done before. But what Thurs discovered shocked even him. In December 1610, he led soldiers to storm Siegate Castle. What they found defied imagination: corpses strewn across chambers, torture devices dripping with dried blood, and mutilated survivors barely clinging to life. The air reeked of death, and the walls were painted with years of carnage. The nightmare Elizabeth had built in secrecy now stood exposed in the light. But the question remained: what punishment could fit such a crime, especially for someone so powerful? Elizabeth's servants were arrested, tortured, and executed publicly. They were burned alive, their deaths meant to satisfy public outrage. Elizabeth herself, however, was spared a trial. The truth was too dangerous. A public trial would reveal decades of corruption, bribes, and church complicity. Too many powerful names were tied to her. Instead, Elizabeth was sentenced to life imprisonment inside her own castle. She was bricked into a small chamber with only tiny slits for food and air. For 4 years, she lived in darkness and isolation. In 1614, guards found her lifeless body. Alone, forgotten, and walled away, the Blood Countess met her end not in flames, but in silence. Elizabeth Báthory's crimes inspired centuries of vampire legends: the aristocrat who bathed in blood to preserve youth. But her true legacy is more disturbing. For over 2 decades, hundreds of girls died while authorities looked away. Her wealth and power shielded her, proving that even the most horrific crimes can be ignored when committed by the elite. The real horror isn't just her brutality, it's how normal it became to everyone around her. The next time you hear of powerful people escaping justice, remember Elizabeth Báthory. Some monsters are not born in myths, they walk among us wearing crowns.